Welcome to the Genius Quiz Arena, friends. Which country is number one in the world? Most people think they know the answers, but this quiz will prove otherwise. Get ready for 60 mind-twisting questions that will shock you, confuse you, and blow your mind. Let's see how many you can get right. Before starting, please subscribe to the Genius Quiz Arena for more exciting quizzes. Question number 1. Which country is number one in total coffee consumption? Finland. Which country is number one in producing solar energy? China. Which country is number one in olive oil production? Spain. Which country is number one in smartphone usage per capita? South Korea. Which country is number one in sugar exports? Brazil. Which country is number one in chocolate consumption? Switzerland. Which country is number one in fastest mobile internet speed? UAE. Which country is number one in beef production? USA. Which country is number one in beer consumption per capita? Czech Republic. Which country is number one in movie production? India. Which country is number one in rice export? India. Which country is number one in tallest average height? Netherlands. Which country is number one in gold production? China. Which country is number one in cheese consumption? Denmark. Which country is number one in the number of islands? Sweden. Which country is number one in speaking English as a second language? Netherlands. Which country is number one in YouTube users? India. Which country is number one in smartphone manufacturing? China. Which country is number one in meat consumption per capita? Australia. Which country is number one in tourist arrivals yearly? France. Which country is number one in producing milk? India. Which country is number 1 in car manufacturing? China. Which country is number 1 in tea consumption per capita? Turkey. Which country is number 1 in avocado production? Mexico. Which country is number 1 in sugar consumption per capita? Mexico. Which country is number 1 in exporting seafood? China. Which country is number 1 in military spending? USA. Which country is number 1 in oil production? USA. Which country is number 1 in electric vehicle sales? China. Which country is number 1 in whiskey consumption? India. Which country is number 1 in number of billionaires? USA. Which country is number 1 in energy drink consumption? USA. Which country is number 1 in exporting coffee beans? Brazil. Which country is number 1 in social media usage hours? Philippines. Which country is number 1 in chocolate production? Ivory Coast. Which country is number 1 in gaming revenue? China. Which country is number 1 in tallest buildings count? China. Which country is number 1 in pizza consumption? USA. Which country is number 1 in renewable energy production? China. Which country is number 1 in TikTok users? Indonesia. Which country is number 1 in producing bananas? India. Which country is number 1 in smartphone gaming hours? Philippines. Which country is number 1 in laptop exports? China. Which country is number 1 in car ownership per capita? USA. Which country is number 1 in plastic waste generation? USA. Which country is number 1 in tallest population on average? Netherlands. Which country is number 1 in chocolate exports? Germany. Which country is number 1 in electric bike sales? China. Which country is number 1 in beer production? China. Which country is number 1 in mango production? India. Which country is number 1 in internet users count? China. Which country is number 1 in exporting toys? China. Which country is number 1 in sugarcane production? Brazil. Which country is number 1 in wheat exports? Russia. Which country is number 1 in fish consumption per capita? Maldives. Which country is number 1 in electric power consumption? China. Which country is number 1 in cinema screens? China. Which country is number 1 in smartphone addiction rate? South Korea. Which country is number 1 in gold reserves? USA. Which country is number 1 in chocolate imports? Germany. Well done! You've reached the end of the Which country is number 1 quiz. Now the real question is, how many did you get correct? Drop your score in the comments. I'll be reading every single one. If you enjoyed this challenge, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you never miss a new quiz. See you in the next Brain Challenge.